Welcome back to Red Cedar Radar. Long time no see, but we're back in action. We have quite a bit to cover today. We're going to be doing one episode about football, Paul and I today, and then we're going to be talking about basketball in a different episode that will go up after our football episode here. How are you today, Paul?
I am doing well. Just wanted to wish everybody Merry Christmas to those that celebrate and a Happy New Year. We are actually
Yeah,
recording this on New Year's Eve, so
yeah,
probably it might be 2024 by the time many of you hear this, but hopefully everyone's had a great holiday.
yeah. I mean, as far as basketball that's going on, and I guess in recent football news, things are going okay heading into the new year. So, knock on whatever this is, wood here. Um, So let's get started with football. We have a lot to talk about. Jonathan Smith has pretty much hit the ground running since coming to campus. So our publisher at Spartans Illustrated, David Harn, put out an article to kind of break down how Jonathan Smith has done in his first 30 days, all the things that happened, bringing in his new staff, players leaving, players staying, all of that turnover that happened. And he kind of really broke things down really well. So that article will be linked in the description of our episode here. But Paul and I are just going to talk through some of the things that he reported on, just because I think it's really good stuff. And I think Jonathan Smith has been doing some really good stuff since coming to campus. What are your thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, I think that, as you mentioned, David wrote a very nice article on Spartans Illustrated about those first 30 days, and he was able to pull from some, I guess you could say, confidential sources. We've done a good job, and by we I mean David and some of the other staff, of developing some of these relationships within the athletic department and even starting with the new staff. And so that's been able to give us some insight that you might not see other places. And some of the things that David commented on was just that Smith seems to be very focused on building up relationships. That's the way he ran things in Corvallis while head coach of Oregon State. And that's very much the approach that he's bringing to East Lansing. And based on David's reporting, it seems to be having been very receptive to the staff in East Lansing. Certainly, and by that I mean the support staff, because as we know, Smith brought in almost an entirely new coaching staff that was almost a copy paste from what he had while at Oregon State. And I guess some could question whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it sounds like from what we're hearing from our sources that it's generally going very, very well, because it's been essentially a seamless transition with this new administration. Some of the words that have been mentioned in regards to Smith is that he has significant attention to detail, in that it was said that because you can basically tell that he's a former quarterback because he has a very systematic way of approaching everything, and then he seems very genuine to everyone. And that's certainly all a good thing. Interestingly, it was mentioned that some have referred to his personality or the way he runs things as vanilla, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just kind of, what to expect, what it's going to be. We're here to win championships. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we run things. And it's just very black and white. And so
Yeah,
that was kind of the big
sorry, can
picture.
I interrupt for a
Yeah, go
second?
ahead, please.
I just feel like that's such a big twist from what we had before with Mel Tucker, and I think is very refreshing. Like listening to his speech at the first basketball game where he was like, "Oh, hi, I'm Jonathan Smith. We're going to get stuff done. There's a lot of work to do." Like, and that was it. And then he just walked back and sat in his seat, and it just felt like he's a guy that's there to work and maybe not to build his personal brand as much.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And that sort of getting to work attitude or putting in the work was also some of the details that was mentioned in the article is that it was mentioned that this staff works very, very hard. And that they basically won't be outworked, and that also goes for some of the support staff that he brought in, and someone that David mentioned was Michael Doctor, who his official title is Director of Recruiting and Player Relations, and of course, again, relationships are very important. And it's also been said that the Doctor is also a tireless worker. And it was even mentioned that he is basically Smith's secret weapon for what that's worth, and that he might be working behind the scenes. Many fans might not know who that is, but he seems to be the one that is essentially keeping things going in the background and making sure all those relationships are where they should be. So that, again, is a very big positive on the new staff.
Yeah. I just feel like him bringing over all of his staff, or the majority of the staff, or the people that he brought over, just speaks to that relationship thing again, because they're willing to follow him across the country. They must have bought into what he's, what the attention to detail, the system that he's putting out. They must have bought into that, or they wouldn't come across the country with him. Maybe they would for a paycheck, but that just seems like a big deal. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think obviously there's a lot of money in college football these days, and in kind of high level athletics across the board. But then you have to ask yourself, a lot of these big programs are all going to have money. I mean, Michigan State has
Hmm.
resources. The Spartans may not have as much resources as a Michigan or Ohio State or a Notre Dame or whatever, but you have to find those kind of levers that you can pull and those things that make your program special and unique. And if it is about that one-on-one personal relationship, then I think that's something that can be sustainable in this new kind of NIL era and era of even more money than the last couple decades, if that's possible, which apparently it is.
Yeah. 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 Do you want to
Um,
talk through some of the players that have been in and out of the
yeah,
portal just to kind of give a rundown?
yes, we can touch on that now. So that was, of course, a big deal that we were focused on the last month. Is of course Coach Smith, landed on the ground. I think the in East Lansing the Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend. That's when
Hmm.
he started. And National Signing Day, the early period for college football was December 20th. So that gave him about 25 days to completely reconstruct the recruiting class. And that included both players, coming in from the high school ranks. That was the official signing day on the 20th. But I think, as any Spartan fan will know, there's also been a significant number of players both coming into and going out of the portal. I can't remember what the number was. We had a spreadsheet that we looked at some point. It was something like 20 or 30 players, current Spartans, had entered the portal. And actually, at the signing day press conference, Smith made a very interesting comment. I think that was the one comment that made me kind of raise my eyebrows. And it was that what he said was that we're trying to recruit some, but not all, of the players currently in the portal. So basically, he was saying that they were okay with some of these guys, leaving and not coming back, which I thought was interesting. Now, whether that was due to talent issues, they felt like they could get better players, or whether it was a cultural fit, that's maybe not clear. And there could be probably players in both categories. Of course, one
Yeah.
of the major points of stress was essentially MSU had no quarterbacks at all. All of the quarterbacks had entered the transfer portal, and so when by the, I think maybe by the time Coach Smith basically arrived in East Lansing and got moved into his house, he had no quarterbacks, zero.
Yeah.
So that's not great. Um, but that was something that was clearly, addressed on as far as from the high school ranks. He was able to sign two 3-star quarterbacks. There was Alesso Milosevic, who I believe is from the
Hmm.
state of Illinois.
Yep.
And then he was also able to pull in Ryland Jesse, who I believe he had recruited while at Oregon State. I would have to double check exactly where uh, where he hails from. Actually, he's from La Mesa, California. So
Hmm.
there was a significant number of West Coast guys that had previous relationships um, with with Coach Smith that they pulled from in this recruiting class. But as far as the quarterback room goes, so there's two incoming freshmen, and then the big fish that he landed, of course, was to get the transfer Aiden Childs, who was kind of the quarterback in waiting at Oregon State to follow Smith to East Lansing. So I think most people would say that Childs is sort of the leader in the clubhouse as far as starters. Of course, he's the only one with any college football experience at all right now. I think some have speculated that Michigan State might look to add some sort of transfer quarterback, maybe like a grad transfer to give some, experienced depth. Um, some could argue of whether, how attractive that would be. But I mean, let's not forget that a few years back, MSU was able to pull Russo out of Temple essentially for that same role. Russo competed with um, Peyton Thorne for the starting job
Hmm.
and eventually did lose that starting job. So there is some recent precedent that that type of situation can potentially work, and you never know when injuries might strike. So
Yeah.
you're just one bad step on the AstroTurf away from us, being the starter of a Big Ten team if you're in
Yeah.
that position. So we'll see how that
Well,
plays
and
out.
look at what we have. I mean, this past year, I guess we maybe shouldn't reference all that much, but I mean, when things weren't working and things were falling apart, which that may happen during this rebuilding period, you want to
Mm-hmm.
have different guys that you can give a go to if you need a spark, like we or the team needed on occasion this past season. So it's nice to have that depth for a multitude of reasons. Yeah.
And the other interesting thing I think about the quarterback room is, as we look through the quarterbacks that were on the roster last year, I mean, basically the Spartans tried all of them, right? I mean, they
Mhm.
tried Hauser, they tried Kim, they tried Sam Levitt. Um, I think was there, that was only, yeah, there was only three, right? I almost felt like they played four quarterbacks, but I think they only had the three. All of those players transferred. And I think it was interesting to see where they transferred to.
I thought that
So
as well. I'm glad you brought this up. Yes.
Yeah, so Caden Hauser actually committed to East Carolina. That is, of course, a Group of Five team. I think they're in the American Athletic Conference, if I'm correct. Noah Kim transferred to Coastal Carolina, a good
Hmm.
program, but also in the Sun Belt, not a Power Five team. And then Sam Levitt committed to Arizona State, which, he's a West Coast guy, so that kind of makes sense. But I mean, Arizona State is, they were not exactly a player in the Pac 12, and I believe now Arizona State is moving to the Big 12. So none of these players really. It's not like anybody transferred to Georgia. So
Right.
um, maybe that tells us something about
Yeah.
that room.
I kind of thought that as well. I was curious to see where they would end up, and maybe that would tell me, like, was it truly that the wheels had just like completely fallen off the bus here at MSU and they couldn't do anything about it, or were they just not the guys that we needed at this level, for the team? And so I was curious to see how that was going to shake out. And it kind of shook out the way I expected it to. Um, Sam Levitt being kind of ending up kind of highest level, like out of all three, is kind of what I expected. And I was a little bit surprised about where he ended up though, but we didn't get to see him very much, so I didn't know. And maybe that's why he ended up where he did, because he hasn't seen a ton of play. But yeah, that was a curious thing for me as well, so I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely noteworthy because I think that
Hmm.
does give you an impression of. I don't want to say that the talent leaving the roster, but I mean, if these kids
Yeah.
could get on a Power Five team, they probably would, right?
Right.
So
Yep,
it's just
yep, I agree.
kind of the way the world works.
Yes.
Um, So to say a couple more things about the transfer portal, of course, we had mentioned how Smith was actively trying to re-recruit basically some of those players. Another room that had a large amount of hand wringing, and I think for good reason, was the offensive line, where I think I heard it said that the top nine players were either leave out of eligibility or were in the transfer portal. I think we had JD Duplain and Nick Samak, who I believe are both out of eligibility, although
I think
you know
so.
the way
At,
waivers
at
work, it's
least
hard to say.
Duplain. I'm not sure. Yeah,
I
about
think
Mac. Yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, we've already had a couple players that have entered the portal, which I'm like, that guy still has eligibility left, or like Trey
Yeah,
Mosley just declared for the NFL draft. It's like, but you can't play anymore. So yeah, what
that makes sense. Yeah.
what else are you going to do?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but the Spartans did have several players return, several players from the offensive line. So we had Ethan Boyd return, Brandon Baldwin has announced his return. Phillips is coming back, as is Gino Vandemark. So that's really pretty critical to get all of those
Hmm.
players back. Um, and so I'm personally going to be very curious to see what that unit looks like because I feel like I've been fairly critical of the offensive line and the offensive line coaching in the last administration. It just never seemed to turn the corner. And every year, this was going to be the year because they have such great coaching. And, maybe that's true, but I just frankly never saw it on the field. And so I'm very curious to see what this unit looks like going forward. With these guys back, with the new administration, if nothing else, it's a fresh look. And then there was also a couple pretty significant recruits that were retained by the new staff. There was a big set of twins from Cincinnati. The Lewineski twins did keep their commitment to the Spartans. They were both recruited by the previous staff, and Smith was able to retain them. So the offensive line room looking okay. I mean, you never know what it looks like in the fall, but so far so good there. And then as far as some other players who have also decided to come back, I think a big one was Darius Snow. Obviously, he's been really hampered by injuries over the last 2 seasons. When he's right, he's still a game changer, I think, at the linebacker position. So having him back, I think, is good. I always felt like he was good for the locker room as well. He's got a kind of a
Hmm.
unique personality. Um, And I mean that in a good way. I guess you could interpret
Yeah,
that
yeah.
a few different ways.
No, I
Uh,
agree. I agree. He's kind of like a glue guy, I feel like.
yeah,
And since he's been injured, just has that experience, and there he has been a piece that has been missing, I felt, you know, over
yeah,
the last season, but like over his time being injured for a while. I thought that. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm excited to have him back. We also have Glover back in the wide receiver room. We did the Spartans did lose a few other pretty major wide receivers, so that's going to be a bit in flux. Obviously, as I just mentioned, Trey Mosley is out of eligibility and going to work on trying to get into the NFL. Christian Fitzpatrick entered the portal. It looks like he's committed to Marshall, so he's off the table. We also had Tyrell Henry, who had some pretty major plays last fall. He is actually committed to Wisconsin, which is interesting. That's
Hmm.
maybe one of the few players so far that has committed to another Power Five program. So that tells you that may be a bigger loss than some of the others. Um, but and then we also have it's not a wide receiver per se, but Malik Carr is still hanging out in the transfer portal, and he's
Hmm.
maybe one of the more interesting ones because there's been a question of whether culturally he's a good fit with the new staff because just based on some of the quotes that he's put out there in public, he may not be the hardest worker on the team, so to speak. I don't think that's a secret. So there's a question of whether if he wants to come back, the door will still be open for him to come back, and I don't have the answer to that. But we'll see.
Yeah. I just, like you said, there's been some times, I mean, he dropped a lot of passes. And there was some times that I felt like he just didn't really care and didn't really go after it. And it
Mm-hmm.
just kind of fell out of his hands. And he was like, oh, oh well. And maybe, might not be exactly like that. But from my perspective, that's kind of what it felt like. And listening to him, give an interview after the Indiana game and a couple different times where I was like right in front of him with him, I was kind of like, yeah, I don't know that you really care all that much. And I don't think that Jonathan Smith is the type of guy that will entertain someone that doesn't care all that much. Maybe not.
Nope.
I don't know, but he just doesn't seem like it.
Yep, I agree 100%. I
Yeah.
If I'm a betting man, I don't think he's back next year, and I don't know if he
Yeah.
wants to come back, but I don't expect to see Malik Carr on the roster next year.
Yeah. Yep.
And I believe that the Spartans did get a transfer from Oregon State in the tight end room. So, and I'd have to um, look up his name. Yes, Jack Velling. I believe
Mm.
yes, Oregon State transfer Jack Velling potentially could be a plug and play replacement for Carr. And as I recall of Oregon State's system, they make pretty heavy use of the tight ends. So it's I think they're going to find some guys that they can play there. And there is some promising young talent on the Michigan State roster that didn't really see the field. I mean, I think there was like 8 tight ends on the roster last year, so I think they're gonna be okay at that spot.
Yeah. I want to say, and I don't know this for sure, but I saw a graphic comparing Malik Carr's stats to Jack Velling's stats,
Mm,
and Jack had produced more this last season. I mean, probably depends on, like you said, if they're using the tight end position quite a bit, and obviously last season at MSU may not be the best comparatively, to other things, but I feel like I saw that on Twitter, and it was like this would be a net positive for Michigan State to get this guy to come. So we'll see.
yeah, I that's in line with my intuition there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it'd be interesting to have Brendan's opinion on this, but
We
he
can
knows a little
phone.
bit
I'll
more about
phone
some
him
of
in.
these. Oh yeah,
Put him.
phone a
Put
friend.
that in the chat.
Okay, yeah, Brendan, what do you think?
Yeah.
And I guess as far as some of the other skill positions that we've seen, it does look like, and I'd forgot about this till I just looked at the list again, that Spartans also got a commitment from a Purdue transfer, wide receiver TJ Sheffield. Um, they also received a transfer from Wisconsin, linebacker Jordan Turner. So maybe that's a one-for-one trade
Mm.
for Tyrell Henry. Who
Yeah.
knows? So those are some of the names coming and going. As far as some of the other current players that have since pulled their names from the transfer portal, Derek Harmon on the defensive line was a big one. He opted to come back just a couple days ago. And we also recently heard that Chuck Brantley at the cornerback position is returning. So those are both big retention, so to speak. Although Brantley, I think, has shown a lot of talent, but I feel he's been injured more than he's been healthy over his
Mm.
entire career, which
Yeah.
makes you a bit nervous. And then I neglected to mention this as far as other wide receivers is that the Spartans were able to retain the commitment of Nick Marsh, who was a local
Hmm.
kid. Um, and it was in fact said that him and his mother has also made a bit of a reputation for herself on Twitter.
Yeah,
Mamatron is what she goes by. And Smith actually called them both out personally and said that they were very helpful in helping to kind of recruit on his behalf even after he arrived in East Lansing. So that was a big help. And I know there was a lot of concern that he might decide to go elsewhere, but I believe Marsh was the highest ranked. I believe he is a 4-star according to Rivals. So that was kind of the biggest retention that we
yeah,
saw.
yeah,
And again, talented wide receivers are always nice to have. So um,
absolutely.
so
Well, and
that was good.
having, like you brought up, having a family that's so bought in is a big deal too, because this is a new culture that's coming, and you want people that are going to be with the team and bought in like that, supporting the players, because it might be a little bit rocky at first, like I said before, since this is a transition. So it's just, I feel like, a win all the way around.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to touch on a couple other players that came in the most recent recruiting class, Smith was able to retain the commitment of Jalen Thompson, who was a defensive back from Tennessee. He was another one of the higher ranked players on the board. And they also brought in two players that they think can play the running back position. So Mekhi Frazier and Brandon Tullis. I believe Frazier was listed as an athlete, and some have speculated that he could play linebacker, and that's often those two positions have similar body types, and so especially at
Yeah.
the high school level, kids will often play both ways, and the running backs will be linebackers. But based on what Smith said in his signing day press conference, he expects both of those players to be running backs. But
Okay.
again, that's now, and the spring is the spring, and the fall is the fall. So everything's certain until it's not. So we'll see how those things go.
I really feel like things are coming together nicely. Obviously, there's tons to keep up with the transfer portal and new staff and everyone coming in. Um, so this has been a really good rundown, even for me, because I feel like there's been so many. I'm entering the transfer portal. No, I'm coming back. Who is this new commit? I don't really know much about him. Was he from the previous administration? Is he new? Like all that sorts of stuff. So this has been a good rundown. But I just feel like things are trending positively. Um, and it looks like our Michigan State's recruiting rankings went up during this time that Jonathan Smith has been working. Looks like from 90 to 51 on Rivals, which I feel like, I don't know, I guess, how long or how often that changes. It probably changes all the time, but that seems like a big jump to me. Um,
Yeah, definitely. And recruiting rankings are they're they're
yeah.
pretty subjective. I mean, there's different
Yeah.
ways to measure that, and I could talk about measuring that for 20 minutes, but we won't worry with that. But because some of it is based on how many players you get, and the class was fairly small. The class of high school recruits there's only 19 commits, which is actually a little bigger than I thought it was. And so it's a combination of quantity and quality, essentially.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing to realize, and I didn't pull these numbers in the last 24 hours or so, but this class that Smith brought in 25 days is already ranked higher than any class he ever had at Oregon State. And that's pretty significant because, I mean, he had Oregon State win in 9-10 games with, 2-star recruits. So one thing we had talked about previously is how player development may improve under Coach Smith relative to the Mel Tucker regime, because that was something that there was a lot of hype about recruiting rankings, but it's hard to really say that a lot of players got better when he was there, and so that's definitely something to keep an eye out for. Um, Another thing I'll mention as far as the defense, as far as the existing players, there was one player in particular that, to my knowledge, is not in the transfer portal, which is pretty significant, and that's Jordan Hall. He was a freshman linebacker last year. He saw more time as the season went on, and I think he is perhaps the most important player to keep. And I think there's various transfer windows that open and close. There were some indications that some of the players might be sticking it out until the spring game because there's another opportunity to leave town after that. I would put him number one on my list to try to keep because if nothing else, the previous coaching staff spoke volumes of Hall's leadership. He was compared to Kirk Cousins, which I thought was, again, that was one of those moments in a press conference where you raise your eyebrows and you're like, it's a pretty bold statement to make. And he's not obviously not the same player, but to be mentioned in the same word as Kirk Cousins from a leadership standpoint is pretty significant. I mean, Cousins was a captain 3 years, starting his sophomore year, even though he was currently in a heavy quarterback battle um, at the time, which he eventually did win with Keith Nickel. He was still elected a captain, so that was that's when you knew something was up, basically, with Kirk Cousins, and now he's making a lot of money in Minneapolis, so good for him. Um, just to touch on a couple other things from the recruiting class, it is stocked pretty heavily with West Coast kids, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. They actually had two players from Hawaii, and that was mentioned at the signing day press conference. We have Rustin Young, who's an offensive lineman from Honolulu, and then there's also a um, Kikai Burnett, who's a defensive end from Honolulu. So that's a long way to go. There is some interesting history with Michigan State pulling in some players from Hawaii historically. That was also mentioned. So those will be some players to keep an eye out for. As far as other highly ranked players, we have Andrew Brinson, who's an athlete out of Tampa, Florida. He's a high 3-star that I just wanted to touch on, in addition to the players that we've already mentioned. And then there's actually one more, which was a flip that happened at the last, maybe on signing day, and that was Brady Pretz, Pretziev. I should have just said that quickly to made it sound like I actually knew what I was doing. But Brady hails from Gaylord, Michigan, and he was committed to Minnesota. This is significant because there was one major role on the coaching staff that was not filled, which was the defensive coordinator. So the existing defensive coordinator of Oregon State stayed in Corvallis, and Smith was able to pull Joe Rossi from Minnesota. And so it was thought that essentially that Coach Rossi brought Pritsayev with him, kind of so to speak, from Minnesota, even though the kid is from Gaylord. So he's a 3-star linebacker, but I think a lot of people were very high on him. So that was another significant pull from the on signing day and within the coaching staff.
Well, and I think in our last episode, that whole thing kind of ties off something that we had talked about Jonathan Smith and his staff not having as many Midwest ties, having Joe Rossi from Minnesota. He's been in Minnesota for a little while, I think, right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. So he has built those relationships up with some kids in the Midwest already. And that is a pure example right there of bringing in those kids that are close to home and having that tie with, with Joe and or Coach Rossi. I don't know, not first name basis, I guess. But yeah, that was something that I was like, okay, that checks off a box that I was kind of waiting to see how that was going to turn out.
Mm-hmm.
So
And I expect that Coach Smith will start to, I don't think he's going to just recruit in like Hawaii and Idaho going forward. I think that naturally he's going to try to start developing those relationships with some of the coaches in Ohio and in Michigan and Indiana, Pennsylvania.
absolutely.
Especially Ohio was brought up during the signing day press conference. Some have speculated, and I think there's data to back this up, that Mel Tucker, I don't want to say abandoned the state of Ohio, but he just didn't seem to bring in as many players from Ohio, and that was something that D'Antonio really feasted on. That coaching staff was able to, um, to use a better, I hate to use this phrase, but kind of get Ohio State's leftovers. But there's enough talented players in Ohio, that if you get Ohio State's leftovers and you develop them, you can still win Big Ten titles. I mean,
Yeah.
D'Antonio proved
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So, I think that's going to be something to keep an eye out on. And go ahead, Sydney.
I just was going to say there's a couple other staffing things that we hadn't talked about yet since we brought
Mm-hmm.
up Joe Rossi. I figured we could bring up Michigan State keeping Courtney Hawkins on, but then Harlan Barnett kind of leaving. So I wasn't sure about either of them because I had heard some things about Courtney Hawkins that maybe there was a little bit of a, cultural, I don't know, difference between him and the players and the new coaching staff that was coming on. And
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't know what they were going to do about Harlan because he had filled that role of head coach. I had my fingers crossed for him to stay just because I think he's a nice guy, but they moved on from him and he moved on from Michigan State after a probably stressful as heck year. Um, what are your thoughts on both of those? Courtney
Um,
staying, Harlan going.
yeah, I think that keeping Coach Hawkins at the wide receiver coach was a pretty good move. I think that certainly helped to make sure that Nick Marsh was able to follow through with his commitment. That seemed to be a pretty big deal. Coach Hawkins also has pretty deep ties into the Michigan high school um, ranks. I believe he was himself, I believe, a head coach at the high school level before he came over to Michigan State's staff. I believe up in the Flint area somewhere, if I remember correctly. And so I think keeping him around, that does give you at least one coach that has can kind of show the new staff the way as far as what it's like to be at Michigan State. He played here. He knows the campus well, and he can sort of act as that bridge from the previous administration to the new one. So I think that's a good retention. We'll kind of see how that goes because, as you said, there may be some indications that there may be not a perfect fit, but we'll kind of see how that goes. Um, as far as Harlan goes, I really agree pretty strongly with what you said that Harlan just seems like such a nice guy, and you really just rooted for the guy. He's a good Spartan. He's been around forever. Um, he just, every time I went to a press conference where he spoke, which was a handful of times, it just, I really liked him as a person. He just gives that sort of very positive vibe that I appreciate. But during the signing day press conference, I don't want to say the writing was on the wall, but it seemed pretty. I was doubtful that he would be retained based on what Smith said because when asked about it, Smith gave a fairly lukewarm response that, well, we're still evaluating the situation. We're going to kind of see what we're going to do. And he wasn't, frankly, that enthusiastic. And I think some other hints that we heard through the grapevine was that Harlan was basically asked to kind of formally interview, which I think does make sense. But it sounds like maybe the way it was done kind of gave him the feeling that you got to he wasn't really the leading candidate for one of the open positions because there is still two open coaching positions and one of them is in the secondary, so he could have potentially slid into that spot, or he could have filled a role as there's a lot of I believe they're called analysts, which are not necessarily on-field coaches but still do a lot of work behind the scenes, and he might have made sense as kind of a emeritus position as an analyst, but apparently they just decided that they would kind of go their separate ways and it would be sort of a clean break, so to speak. So I don't think there's hard feelings there, but it was pretty clear that um, that Marlon's moving on. And I actually have not heard if he's landed anywhere. I'd have to sort of Google that, but or if I did hear, I don't remember. But I'm sure that he's gonna land on his feet. I'm pretty confident of that.
Yeah, that was going to be my question to you. I hadn't heard any updates from that about that at all. So he must still be kind of trying to figure it out because I just Googled just to see, and I don't see. Just everything is about him leaving. So
Yeah,
nothing new yet. Yep.
yeah. I think he's still trying to figure out what his next move is.
Yep. I think that covers a lot of the stuff that I wanted to talk about for football. Anything to kind of wrap us up here before we end our episode?
No, I think we covered quite a bit of Michigan State stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The only one small detail I'll mention is there still seems to be an opening for a special teams coach. Some have argued that you don't necessarily need a special teams coach. Sometimes that's double duty with another position on the staff. And I don't recall what Smith has done in that regard previously. So, but nonetheless, there are still two open positions. And Smith had mentioned that he's not in a really big hurry to fill those. So he's definitely being deliberate, taking his time, and I'm going to be filling those with, I'm sure, some very qualified candidates. And then other than that, I'm just really enjoying all of the Pop Tarts Bowl memes. That's been fun. I hope you've enjoyed those as well. I didn't really
I
see
have.
much of that game, but man, what a time to be alive. We have a Pop Tarts Bowl here in 2023. That's really amazing.
With an edible mascot. I mean, what's better than that? I mean,
Nothing.
only the only thing that's maybe equal or better to that is the Duke's Mayo Bowl, where they just douse somebody in mayo, just because it's so absurd. Um, I do appreciate that one as well.
Yeah, I enjoy Pop Tarts far more than mayonnaise. But yeah, I mean, you
Yeah.
know what? People like to dog on bowl games, but it's or at least not the ones that are not in the playoffs. But
Yeah.
why are we being mad that football's being played? Like
I
in,
know.
in, in April, we're going to be like, wow, I really wish I could watch the Duke's Mayo
Hmm.
Bowl right now. So, let's just be happy that there's football. And it'll be interesting to see
Yeah.
what happens next year with the 12-team playoff. I assume that there'll still be some semblance of the old bowl system. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it'll be interesting. There's all this stuff with some of the opt outs. I mean, the Florida State Georgia game and I guess that would have been the Orange Bowl was, that was kind of a bloodbath.
Hmm.
And Ohio State didn't look very good against Missouri either.
I
And
know.
and
That
it
was
is
a
this
terrible
question.
game.
Yeah, it was not good. It made the Red Box Bowl look exciting. Um, and it is hard to judge. Like the Big Ten is doing okay. Like the lower level teams are doing okay, but Penn State got
Hmm.
beat pretty soundly by Ole Miss,
I
and
know.
Ohio State got beat. We'll see how the Wolverines do against Bama
That
here
was
in a
going to
couple
be
of
my
days.
question. What do you think? Do you have a prediction for that?
Um, well, it's hard to say because I think that certainly since Michigan, was prevented from using other teams' signals, their production has gone down, and I think that is quantifiable, and I think it's true, despite what some people in Ann Arbor want to believe, because reality is what they want to believe, not actual reality down there. But I think that is very clear. I think they certainly looked much more mortal since those allegations came out, and so we'll see how that plays out. But then there's a part of me that also says that Alabama's not, they're not really, sort of vintage Alabama. And so those
Hmm.
two factors playing together tells me that it's going to be a close game. And I mean, the point spread is about between 1 and 2 points in Michigan's favor right now. But at the end of the day, we have Alabama and Nick Saban against Michigan and Jim Harbaugh. And like it or not, Wolverine fans, if any of you are listening, if you are, hi, Michigan has not done well in big time games for, you could argue, 20 years, or you could argue
Yeah.
70 years. Because let's be honest, they have one half of a national title in 1997 where they got to play Washington State, the amazing Pac 12 powerhouse of Washington State. And yes, they won. Good job. Would they have beaten Nebraska? I don't think so. But, you get half a title. Good job. Hang the banner. Um, but I mean, they're mostly known for losing big games. I mean, Bo Schembechler was legendary for losing the Rose Bowl. I think he had to go there 5 or 6 times before he won it. And I think I also look up a stat that Michigan has exactly one more Rose Bowl win since 1953 than Michigan State does. So, you know, that's significant. And you can laugh that
Yeah.
off as rivalry banter, but it's true. Michigan has not done well in this stage. Maybe they'll, and things are true until they're not. So maybe this will be the year that they do finally break through, and they
Yeah.
actually can beat a good team legitimately. But I'll believe it when I see it. So roll tide. I'm going to take Bama in that game. Um,
Yeah.
and then I think it's going to be I think it's going to be a rematch of that game in September between Texas and Bama, because if I'm rooting for one team, it's Washington. I just think that would be fun. I like Michael Penix Jr.
Yeah. Me too.
I would prefer to see them win it all. I think that'd be fun. But I just don't believe in Washington's defense. I think Texas is probably gonna edge them, and then Texas versus Bama, the rematch. Is it? Can you honestly pick against Bama? I don't know if I can. So I
No.
kind of wonder if Saban's gonna somehow pull another rabbit out and put another ring on his finger. He's run out of fingers, but that's
I
how I see it
just,
playing out.
do you think if he wins, he'll retire?
Hmm. I had not thought about that, and I have not. I
Yeah.
think he's in his 70s now, so maybe he will.
Well, okay, I saw the picture of him and Jim Harbaugh standing with Mickey Mouse, and I was like, whoa, he's a grandpa. And maybe that's mean to say, but like, I don't keep up too much with Alabama. I mean, I know that they're good. I've watched some of their games, but I don't keep up on Nick Saban too much. But I was like, wow, he looks like a little old man a little bit. And I just was curious to see if he won this out, that he'd be like, did what I had to do. I'm out. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, coaches are coaching well into their 70s. It does say here on the
Mm-hmm.
old internet that he is 72 years old. So, if he does win
Yeah.
a title, maybe, title number, what, 7? I feel like it would be 7 for him.
Mm, I'm not sure.
So that'd be a lot. I think maybe that'd be enough for me. But,
Yeah,
once you win 7, then you can win 8. Oh, no, it says
that's
he
true.
already has 7. My goodness, this could be number 8.
Oh, yeah. And then you end on a nice even number.
Yeah.
You retire. I don't know where you go.
I don't
if you
know.
retire from Alabama, some island somewhere,
Yeah,
and you
you
live out
probably
the
buy
rest
an
of your
island.
days stress free.
Yeah, and but personalities like that, you do wonder if once that sort of stress is removed, that it's actually not good for that person's health. I
Yeah,
mean, it's, that
yeah,
often does happen, so you do
that's
worry
true.
about that. And we're just thinking
True.
about Uncle Nick. We
Right.
want Uncle Nick to be okay. He is a Spartan after all. I remember him being introduced during a Michigan State basketball game when I was, I believe, a sophomore at Michigan State, and thinking like, who the heck is this guy? It's like Cleveland Browns defensive coordinator. Okay, whatever. Um, but
Look at
turned
him
out he
now.
knows what he's doing.
Yeah, yeah, somewhat.
Yeah, he's okay as a head coach. He's fine.
Yeah, I think that kind of wraps up our coverage of football. Like I said, David's article that has a lot of the information that Paul and I ran through will be linked in the description of this episode, so check that out. Um, we will, like I said at the beginning of our episode, we'll be breaking down basketball here next. So that episode will be coming shortly after this one. Um, Subscribe to Spartans Illustrated to get more news about basketball and continuing coverage of football. And you can find this podcast on YouTube. You can subscribe to our Spartans Illustrated YouTube page and wherever you listen to our audio versions, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, lots of other options. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you again soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.